Sometimes with our kids, it is their first time ever experiencing those things. And we have experienced them potentially many times. And we have to put ourselves back in that spot of like, this is maybe their very first time getting in a fight with a friend. This might be their very first time skinning their knees. This might be, I
think at the end of the day, like our behavior says a lot about what we are personally going through in terms of our human experience. And if we take time to tune into that, to gain the awareness and to heal that part, a lot of times these behaviors, the maladaptive behaviors or, that kind of thing can be healed. And that just kind of changes who we are as people and as a society.
When we think about childhood anxiety and depression, we tend to picture extreme cases: the child who refuses to leave the house, the teen who stops eating, the student whose grade plummets overnight. But these are signs that we often associate with serious mental health struggles.
Too often we miss the quieter, everyday signs, like the perfect student who has a meltdown over getting that B+, the kid who suddenly hates school but can't explain why, or the child who spends hours replaying a minor playground interaction in their heads. These are the moments when suffering hides in plain sight.
When I was in the classroom, I saw how these subtle behaviors, oftentimes when they were dismissed as just a phase, would continue to snowball until it was a much bigger issue.
And in my work with mental health, I've seen how stigma and systemic gaps keep patients from getting the help that they so often need.
So that's why we're recognizing that anxiety and depression doesn't always have to look dramatic. It's really critical that we understand the first steps in really helping our kids understand how they're feeling is to recognize that their feelings aren't flaws. Whether it's perfectionism or avoidance, suffering is truly suffering.
So today we're breaking down how early intervention and school-family partnerships can change these trajectories. We'll cover a few points, including why asking what's hurting works better than why are you acting out? Practical strategies like emotional charts and worry time rituals that help kids name their feelings before they escalate. The systemic barriers leave teachers untrained and parents feeling fearful of these labels. And lastly, how shame lingers when mental health goes unaddressed and how we can disrupt that cycle. Today, we're honored to welcome Jessica Alexander, a licensed marriage and family therapist and a passionate advocate for systemic relational approaches to mental health.
As a specialist in addressing problems from systemic perspectives, Jessica equips families and individuals with practical tools to navigate emotional challenges and create meaningful changes in their lives.
Her work emphasizes the importance of relationships, both with others and with oneself, and has transformed how people view and tackle mental health struggles. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Jessica. All right, so before we get started, as if you have been following us, I am on a mission. I really want to destigmatize the human experience. I truly believe that the human experience is generally uncomfortable, fairly awkward, and challenging for sure. So there are so many components and so many emotions that go into be human. So #BeHuman. So Jessica, if you don't mind, what is one human thing that has happened to you recently that you would like to share with us and our listeners?
Sure. So last week, I had a prior engagement and I wasn't able to help my mom out with something. And she called me and shared her feelings and opinions with me. And I did not show up as my best self. I got defensive and I shut down and I wasn't really willing to hear her perspective, if you will. So I looking back and reflecting, I realized that, a lot of that was me and my response to those things. So
I feel like that is so relatable. Like, I mean, I don't think a single human on our planet doesn't experience that, where you look back and you're like, oh, I did not do that the way I should have. I think that being defensive is such a first an instinct for so many of us in those moments. Did you go back and repair it with your mom? Because I think that's the #most be human part of recognizing, ooh, I goofed and now I need to go back and fix it.
Yes, I did follow back up with her on the call actually. And I apologized for, the actions and the way that she felt based on my actions and that kind of thing. So there was repair that took place. Yes.
Not that I'm your mom and I'm not going to require you to apologize to other people. I'm not your teacher, but I think that is the hardest part of those human interactions. We all have them, but even with my own children, I have to sometimes take a step back and be like, ooh, I cursed at my child and I should probably go back and apologize for that. I noticed I wasn't my best self and I need to repair that. Awesome. Well, thank you for sharing. It's always great to remember the things that make us human. So with that, let's go ahead and let's get started. Could you tell us just a brief little intro about yourself, your story, the work that you're doing?
Sure. Yeah. So I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist in the state of Georgia. Throughout my career, I've worked with all different types of people, or they have substance use problems, mental health challenges. I actually got into the field working with teenagers and adolescents and absolutely loved that. And later wanted to kind of challenge myself and work with adults because at the time I found them to be very intimidating and scary. So through different experiences of working at psych hospitals and just working in outpatient programs, kind of trying that expanding my practice, if you will. But actually, the thing that got me into the field, I had every intention of being an interior designer back in the day. I don't know if you guys remember the show Trading Spaces, but I was like hooked on it. And I was like, I want to be an interior designer. I'm going to do all these cool things. And then my parents actually went through a pretty tough divorce, and that changed the trajectory of my life. And my mom obviously popped back up again. She said that I needed to go to therapy and work through some of my feelings. And so I did that, and I fell in love with the process and how amazing it felt to just kind of release with someone that doesn't know every person in my family dynamic. And and so after that, I was just like, you know what? I want to be a therapist. I want to help teen girls that are going through these things. And the rest is kind of history at this point.
That's so beautiful because honestly, I think one of our biggest hurdles in this work is like helping people to understand that process and how easy it actually is to engage in that process. And the way you just worded that was so beautifully said. And it's just like life-changing, truly.
You went from working on healing to transitioning into a healer of sorts. It's not exactly precise, but I love that.
All right, so let's go ahead and let's jump into it. So the CDC reports that 1 in 10 children are diagnosed with anxiety and 1 in 25 with depression. Yeah, and I would say diagnosed. I think that any of us who are on the ground working with these kiddos would say that, as an educator, I would say at least 7 out of 10 children probably experience pretty intense anxiety symptoms. And depression, that's a little bit harder for me to possibly put a number to. But I do think it's important to recognize these are diagnosed versus, maybe what we're seeing on the grounds. Yet these oftentimes go unnoticed. So what are the most overlooked signs of elementary age kiddos that you find in your work?
Sure. So I think a lot of times with children, their stomach aches, right? They have a lot of stomach aches. That is actually a symptom of depression, right? So little tiny bodies don't necessarily have the words to articulate how they are feeling and what they're experiencing. So it comes out in kind of the somatic symptom, if you will. As someone who struggles with anxiety and has struggled with anxiety since I was probably in kindergarten, if not sooner, I remember reflecting back and I'd be like, my stomach hurts. And my mom would always, ask questions and be like, are you nervous about something? And I was, right? So, I think stomach aches is a big thing. Avoidance is another huge thing. Not wanting to go to school, not sleeping well at night.
Lots of bathroom trips just to get out of the classroom and away from whatever. Mm-hmm.
Yep, exactly. I also think that sometimes with depression, kids can be more tired and just be sleeping more often. I had a client one time describe it very, very well. And we normally think of a nap, right? Where we take a quick little one. Sometimes people take a couple hour nap, but when you're depressed, you take naps for hours upon hours and you wake up to go to the bathroom and then go right back to sleep.
Back to it.
Exactly. So in this situation, especially with kids, I think it's just a shift in their overall kind of demeanor and personality. They have such big emotions, but they might not have the words to articulate how they feel. And so at least for me, when I, work with kids and teens, the biggest thing that I always ask the parents is, how is their sleep? How are their grades doing? A lot of times we see a dip in grades in terms of academic achievement and that kind of thing. And then also just how they are interacting with the family. Are they spending more time in their room? Are they more irritable? Are they crying more often?
Easily triggered. Yeah. I was just going to add the other thing too, with the sleep thing, our brains process so much trauma and such in our sleep stages. So it's super, super important. But the other thing I saw as an educator too was the exact opposite too. A lot of our anxious kids, especially, and the kids have access to so much of the world's knowledge and they're anxious about so many of the things going on our planet. And it truly does keep them up at night. So one extreme or the other, I feel like. Same thing with like eating, right? One extreme or another, for sure.
Yeah. I think it's also important because there is so much content available to kids and, kids these days, setting appropriate boundaries, right? Around like how much screen time they might have and like how much time, you allow them to like watch the news. I mean, obviously every family is different, but just kind of being mindful of what they're absorbing because kids are sponges and they take everything in.
I was going to ask on that, like, what's a guideline? And I understand every family is different, but if you could just pick your guideline, what would that be? Throw a dart at it. How much time is okay? How much is more than enough?
So for me personally, I mean, I think we can all probably relate to this just as adults, and then I'll scale it back. But I know when I've had a stressful day, I come in and I just what they call doom scrolling, right? I'm just sitting there and I'm like, oh my gosh, like an hour has passed. Like, why did I just watch that video of cake decorating? So I think they get me. I don't know why, but they do. So I think it's just important to make sure that the child is able to execute the tasks that are being asked of them because there needs to be structure put in place, right? Structure, as much as kids hate it or people hate it, it actually makes them feel safe. They know what to expect. They know the routine, so then they can they don't personally lessen the anxiety, but because there is the safety that's felt, they're not as anxious and on edge, right? But when it's just willy-nilly, it creates more anxiety. So in terms of, throwing a dart at it, I would say more it goes back to like, how are the tasks being completed and like, how are they interacting versus like, I would say, an hour here.
Quantity. Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
I was just going to say the same thing. It's sort of like it's like food, right? Like we need to teach our kids, you can't eat the whole piece of cake or the whole cake, but you can have a piece of cake, right? It's that the kids need to really find something in the middle, that gray area, whether it's technology or whatever. I think one of the things that I have done with both my own children and other kids is really helping them understand, like, is this a positive coping mechanism right now, or is it a negative coping mechanism? Because what is your intention behind it? Like, is it to zone out of your problems and not paying attention to your problems? Or like I play the dumbest game on my phone every night. I don't even know. My husband and I call it crappy Sudoku. I don't even know what it's actually called. Honestly, it's just like this most brainless game ever. But I do so much processing of my life while I'm just aimlessly sitting there moving these little pieces around. So there's like pros to doing that kind of processing on technology. And then there's cons when it's like avoidance tactics, right? Like if I'm playing video games because I have problems and I don't want to think about those problems, so I'm trying to avoid them, I think then it's a negative coping skill, right? So I think really, and then the other thing I would just add is like, we should always be paying attention to what our kids are doing and saying. And, like my son, he's a video gamer. Like I don't understand the video games myself. I used to fight that battle with my husband, less video games. And now I recognize if he's going to do it, we just want to make sure it's in a safe environment. The people you're playing with are safe. How you all are talking is safe. Like the mental work that you're doing is safe. And so really making sure that you are aware of your kids, what they can do and not do, and how responsible they can be in those environments, I think really plays into that as well.
Well, and just to kind of tie that in, that whole idea of a boundary, like having all that information is a boundary, right? Of like, I need to know who you're talking with, who you're playing with, what games you're playing. You're ultimately setting a boundary of awareness for you as the parent or, the guardian loved one, so that you know kind of what's happening on the other side when they are engaged.
And as parents, you can definitely make that a contract. Just putting that out there. I cannot suggest it more, but like we do that as teachers. Anytime a person signs something, it cognitively does something in our brain where we just become more responsible for that thing. So put it in writing for sure, whatever those boundaries look like.
So studies show that kids with anxiety struggle sometimes with reading emotional cues. How does this create a vicious cycle in their relationships?
Okay, so I think that we have to kind of break that down just a little bit because that's a great statement, but I want to make sure that we kind of address all layers of it, right? So in order for a kid to feel anxious and like read social cues, I think a lot of times they're trying to predict what could come next. And my suggestion or my insight and belief is that there's a lot of stuff that happens within the family dynamic, right? So if we talk about like attachment styles and that kind of thing, children that have an anxious attachment will kind of read cues differently. They might respond in a different way. They physically feel those body sensations, although they might not have the awareness of like the heart palpitations or the sweating or the mind racing, necessarily. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, what'll take place is they're trying to scan to see where the next threat is and how they can either soothe, right, what's going on within them, or also just like protect themselves from the incoming threat. So when I do family therapy with kids and teens, a lot of times it is bringing the child in and we like talk through these different things, but it's also bringing the parent in and making sure that the parent is aware of like, hey, if I'm saying something to you or saying something to the child, right, like that's going to elicit a response. So it's also times getting the parent on the same page to make sure that how they are responding to it is helpful and not like shaming or, minimizing and that kind of stuff. And it's not that parents are like doing this like intentionally, right? Like they don't want to cause harm to their kids, but sometimes it definitely is one of these things where a child will come in and say, hey, mom, hey, dad, like this is what happened to me. Oh, you're fine. Well, then guess what happens after they hear that so many times? They don't say anything anymore.
Extinguished.
Right. So I think a lot of times, yes, I guess to validate the statement, I think that there is this piece, right, where they are trying to read the social cues and figure out what's happening. But ultimately, the deeper work, right, comes in recognizing like, where does that come from? Because sometimes it's only with like females. Sometimes it's with men. Like it just kind of depends. And a lot of times, the more that we peel back the layers to see like what happens in the family dynamic, which is kind of like the systemic part, right? Is the family is a system. And so when we analyze each kind of different person and each role that they play, we have a better understanding of like how the child fits into that space and also how they're receiving and exchanging information with everybody else in the family.
And also like how sometimes these things are just passed down from generation to generation unconsciously and subconsciously. The other thing too is, Darren, your question said that, people with anxiety struggle to read emotional cues. And I would push back that sometimes like if you're being raised, so for example, my father, I would say, has undiagnosed bipolar disorder. Also, I have a diagnosed bipolar disorder, so no shame in that. But I do think that I became very hyper vigilant to his emotional cues. And like even my husband, like he'll come home and he'll have a face or something. And I'm like, did I upset you? And I spend all night and it drives me nuts. And I don't realize until afterwards where I'm like, why did I spend all night in a bad mood? Because my husband had something that happened at work and I took it all on myself and made it personal. And I read all of his emotional cues as something that was me and it triggered my anxiety, right? I think that we've also seen a lot of kids that are very much hypersensitive to other people's cues and misread them a lot.
Yeah, I was going to say, I feel like when that comes up in us as adults, it very much goes back to childhood, right? Of like, there's an unneed met that takes place. And so when we're trying to, I do it too with my husband or with other people in my life. I'm like, wait a second, are they upset with me? And they're like, I'm fine. Like, I don't know. And, but because of my experiences, like I felt like something was different. There was not a threat. Like I didn't think that something, was going to hurt me, but something was different. Something was off. Now I'm more aware. Now I have to figure out like what it is so that I can make adjustments and like try and like fix it. You know what I mean? I also really appreciated your point about how it's like a multi-generational issue because we learn, right? Kids learn from their parents who learn from their parents. So, if there's poor communication within the family dynamic or within that, the bigger system of the multi-generations, it's going to continue to take place.
So, Jessica, earlier you said something about an anxious attachment. I've heard of attachment theory. Can you talk just a little bit more about that?
Sure. So attachment in general, right, actually occurs by the time that we're 2 years old, right? And that takes place with any caregiver. So depending on how our caregiver was attuned to our emotional needs kind of sets the stage for how we show up in relationships, right? So there's 4 different types of attachment styles, the first one is secure. The second one is anxious. And then you have avoidant. And then the last one would be disorganized attachment style. So each one kind of comes with different characteristics and that kind of thing. But anxious attachment style specifically is, where you are anxious that someone is leaving, or there's like this sense of abandonment, or abandonment might be too strong of a word, but you're trying to make sure that like there is connection and that you're able to like, where you are within that space. So if someone is a little bit more avoidant, guess what that's going to do for you as an anxious attachment? It's just going to make you Yes, it's going to make you have all the feels and you're going to want to try to figure out what's going on and like try to repair and resolve whatever could be the conflict in that time. So it's really interesting. There's different quizzes and stuff that you can take online, and there's also therapists out there that are very focused on attachment, based attachment styles and whatnot. So just learning kind of a little bit more about your attachment style, and then also like your partner as well, it explains a lot.
Is there anywhere you would send some of our listeners to, like a website or just a Google search term if they wanted to read any more on it?
Yeah, I would just go ahead and look up attachment styles and just see what comes up from there. If they wanted to get more specific to see which one they feel they fall into, again, it's secure attachment, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, and then disorganized attachment styles.
Schools oftentimes miss academic struggles as red flags. What's one policy change you'd advocate for the better support of kids?
I think at the end of the day, they need to provide the resources for children that are struggling with mental health. I think we've come so far because they have, IEPs and, different adjustments that are made for kids that have different struggles. But I think just continuing to provide the resources is great. I have a lot of different teacher friends, and, they always kind of talk about how they need more like fidget spinners, like kids struggle with ADD and ADHD and that kind of stuff. So if there could be more education around how to help kids cope with it, I think that could be helpful. Also just allowing the resources. I feel like a lot of parents are in tune with their kids and their struggles, but, trying to find a specific therapist or counselor that can meet those specific needs, I think would also really, really help. But in terms of the law, aspect of it, just allowing for those, those specific needs that each student has, I think would be super helpful.
I also think just adding more like how to be a human 101 kind of stuff, right? Like so much of like our academic stuff, I always say like, I don't need to be the keeper of information anymore as a teacher. Like you have so much more information at your fingertips. You need to know how to read so that you can access that information. You need to know how to decipher that information. And then you need to know how to like be resourceful and find the information. And I truly think that we should in schools personally be doing a lot more of like, yeah, we all have imposter syndrome. How do you overcome imposter syndrome? Yes, we all have these thoughts and challenges and, just more how to show up as a human, as an adult in this world that can do this humaning thing. Okay, so can you go ahead and walk us through your first response? I said earlier that I have been labeled my whole life as being too sensitive. Even to this day, I think that my parents will not take my feelings in account and just brush it off as like, it's Erin just being too sensitive again. But what is your response to parents when their children say like, my kid is just too sensitive?
So my initial thought would be to ask the parents like why they feel that is and kind of unpack that and just better understand. I feel a lot of times parents, because of their own experiences, right, and potentially not having the full healing process taking place, and there's no shame in that. It's not me doing any of that. But if you're uncomfortable with your own feelings, it can be hard to then take on your child's feelings and like know what to do with them, right? I keep saying like little bodies, big emotions, like that is such a true thing. And so they feel a lot of things, and I think by just opening the door and like creating space for them to feel those things is great. Now, on the flip side, right? Like if, because I was also labeled very sensitive, like I took things very personally and that kind of thing. And so I remember my mom being like, you need to buck it up, like get it together. And I needed that in the moment. But like looking back too, I'm like, well, that also just kind of sucks because like I felt a certain type of way, So I think that at the end of the day, like there's space for both. Like we can encourage and we can, kind of challenge and that kind of thing, but also just allowing them to say what they feel. And then to me, I would put it back on them and be like, okay, well, how do you think you need to solve this? Right? Like, what's the solution? What do you think we should try? They might not know and it might not make any sense, but at least it's giving them kind of the autonomy to make a choice because at the end of the day, like they know better than me. I see like what's taking place in their life, but I am not them.
At what age would you start doing that? Just again, throwing a dart. That probably wouldn't work with a 1.5-year-old, but what are we talking? 6, 7, 8, 9?
Yeah, I would say probably, kindergarten, they probably know a little bit more about like how they feel. There's also, it's called a feeling wheel, right? So I love them. I use them all the time with my clients.
I think every teacher should have them on every kid's desk everywhere.
Yeah. And if it's like the younger age group, like the facial expressions, right? Like they might not know like angry or frustrated or sad, but like you can look at the face and you can say, oh, that's how I feel right now. So I think just, having that available to them and then, kind of getting them not trained, but, helping them to see that they have the ability to connect with it and then figure out what they need to do from there. But I would say, I mean, 4 or 5, just depending on kind of what's going on in their not maturity level, but just level of insight.
I'm going to add 2 more things. So I think the other thing, as somebody who has been told they are too sensitive all through their lives, I think a lot of things on this topic. Number one is that I think it's always important to validate those feelings. My daughter is also very sensitive, and I also get very stuck in sometimes like, oh, just get over it, Emma. Like, we're just going to move on. Like, it's fine, And then I'm like, nope, I have to remember her feelings are valid. But the other thing too is sometimes with our kids is their first time ever experiencing those things. And we have experienced them potentially many times. And we have to put ourselves back in that spot of like, this is maybe their very first time getting in a fight with a friend. This might be their very first time skinning their knees. This might be, and that's okay for them to feel big feelings now. Like, actually this weekend I cut my thumb pretty deep and my daughter was like amazed that I wasn't crying. And I was like, I've done this so many times in my life. I don't even know if I feel it anymore. But when she cuts her finger, it's like the tiniest little thing and it's a big deal. If we apply that same concept to like all of the things we experience as adults, it makes you understand like, oh, they're not actually being too sensitive. They're just learning. Like they're just going through this experience and process now,
Yeah, I think that a lot of times just being too sensitive or overly sensitive, like it's a bad, kind of connotation and whatnot. But at the end of the day, they're just feelers, right? And so I have seen, especially like in later years as they've grown and whatnot, that they just feel things, and there's nothing wrong with that. But in that family system, maybe emotions are not welcome, or not, certain ones are, and other ones are not welcome. So I think just again, validating is great. That's what I kind of meant by creating space. Like validate their experience. Like we want to do that. That keeps the door open, especially as they get into, adolescence of talking to you. But then also just kind of giving them the autonomy of like, what is the solution? How can I support you right now?
So I'm going to move us along out of the individual family more into like bigger system stuff like the schools. So if you could mandate one universal mental health screening for children, when and how would it happen? This is like your fantasy one. What would you do at the big level?
I would so there's an assessment tool that's called the ACEs, which is, do you guys know about that? That's what so it's the adverse childhood experience. I think it's
checklist.
Yeah. But I would love for all schools to have that, because it would make a lot more sense of the behaviors that we're seeing in a school setting, right? And it's not necessarily that they're being defiant. It's just that there's a lot of stored trauma in their body. And so, sitting still and having to complete a task can be more challenging and more difficult. I would also love for educators to be able to have the knowledge of like, what does ACE, like, what is it? How do you implement, what does it mean? And then how do you show up for kids that score more highly on the ACEs?
I love that you said that. Like, I had never thought of that. And I saw the wheels turning there just for a second. Like, what do I say? And you came up with that one. That is very, very powerful.
So we're trying to get this computer program into schools. And my kid's school principal was like, oh, Erin, we can staff that with our two school counselors, our social worker, and our whatever. And I was like, I don't know though, like we're putting on a computer. So we are hoping to have a touch point with every single student in the week. I was the kind of kid, my dad's an alcoholic. I was the kind of kid who suffered kind of in silence. Like I would always have been like a good kid in the back doing my work, not just regulated. I never would have gone to like the counselor's office because of behavioral things. Do you feel like the system we have right now in our school system is enough? Do you feel like having, no matter how, I've worked in some schools, the middle school, high school I was in the school shooting at, we had probably 9, 10, 11 mental health people on our team. I mean, it was a really robust, the biggest mental health team I have seen, but I still didn't feel like they were able to meet the needs of all of our kids personally. Do you have a picture for kind of the spectrum of how we can support our kids in the school system in this mental health way? What do you feel like what Darren was saying, if you had a magic wand and you could create this mental health system, do you feel like more people? Do you feel like educating our teachers as like mental health professionals in a way could be a good support? It just never feels like we're doing enough. Like our kids need so much more help.
Yeah, I feel like, not to use the word systemic again, but I feel like it's a bigger systemic problem, right? Like if you educate, you give the thing to the curriculum to the kids. Okay, well then does the staff know about how to use it? Like, do they have the interventions and that kind of thing? So for me, knowledge is power. I say that to all of my clients. And so my hope is really that at some point there can be more emphasis placed on mental health and just like what the symptoms mean versus the symptoms define the person, right? So if they're like an anxious kid, like, yeah, like they have anxiety, but like why? Like, let's explore further and like figure out what that is. In a perfect world, there would be, therapists and counselors in the space. I don't know, too much about like the whole school system and all of that, but from the students that I do work with, they still come and see me, and they're usually going to the school counselor. So there are resources that are available. But again, like if you have a client, not a client, but if you have a kiddo that is a little bit more reserved, and like I would have been the same way as you. Like I wouldn't have made the move to go and speak to someone. I was way too shy for that. So I think it's just really figuring out how to cast a net that gets everybody involved and gets all of the needs met. And if people don't need it, that's great. Like we've at least done the screening and tried to figure out like if there's anything else going on. But even in that situation, right, for kids that have experienced trauma, or in Georgia, we call it defects, right? So like where they, are going to state custody because their parents have things that are going on. At some point when you're that young, like you learn to keep your mouth shut because then you're going to be pulled away from your parents. And so, yeah. And which is another trauma. Right. So, when I like really sit and think about it, I get so overwhelmed because I'm like, there's so many things that we could be doing. But I do think that I hope that in the future, right, that there is the ability to really just see every kid, and like kind of understand like what's going on in their world, because they deserve that.
100%. Okay. And last quick little like caveat question to that. I'm curious to know your thoughts on, I guess, even like cell phones in our kids' lives in general. And I can tell you, my son just recently transitioned from a flip phone to a smartphone. And literally, I texted my mom like 12 hours into this and was like, I officially have a teenager. Like I had a kid before, and 12 hours with a smartphone. And he is like way cool. Like I don't know. I just think that it's impacting them so much in so many ways in their mental health. Can you speak to that really quickly?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. The teenagers that I do work with, I'm going to speak more from like a teenager perspective, because they tend to have more phones. A lot of the younger ones that I see have the flip phones or an iPad, but it gets, taken away at night and that kind of thing. But yes, the teenagers or preteens are pretty aware, right? Of like, oh my gosh, like I'm on my phone and I'm doing all these things. And I'll ask questions of like, well, how are you sleeping at night? Because they'll say, oh, I woke up late and it just started my day all wrong. And I'm like, okay, so what are some things that we can do to, kind of change that? And they're like, well, I should probably put my phone somewhere else. I think it comes back to the parents and just having parental involvement. Honestly, again, boundaries and probably systemic is probably the two words that I've used so much, but boundaries is really helpful because again, the kid knows, what's expected of them. I worked at a psych hospital, for a few years on the adolescent unit and kid and adolescent unit, but there were children in there that were like having suicidal thoughts because their parents took their phones away. And that's to me, when I was growing up, like I didn't have a cell phone just, at my every whim. So it's just interesting, but I feel like you were saying, if there are boundaries and there are expectations and, we can use because technology is great, but it needs to be monitored and it needs to be kind of regulated, but the regulation comes from the parents. I know there's like plenty of apps and stuff that kids can get on to like break through the child or the time out things and anyway, but I don't know, to me it's an open conversation because parents oftentimes probably are okay with it because they also are scrolling on their phone for many hours or using it as a form of coping. So the more that the conversation is opened up, and I think just as a family dynamic, like determining what makes the most sense for the unit would be incredibly helpful. As it relates to schools, I know, I'm sorry, I said I was almost done, but as it relates to schools, that's really tricky because I think with everything that happens in the world, right, and like the school shootings and just the lack of safety at times that's felt, I can understand and empathize of like wanting to keep your phone on you. again, for safety purposes. But then at the same time, too, it's like, how do you regulate that? And that can be incredibly, incredibly tricky.
Cell phones were really terrifying in that moment. They were really helpful, but they were also terrifying because we were getting neighborhood ring app notifications, multiple kids dead, like mass school shooting. It ended up being one student who was outside who got shot. Nobody was killed. But, we all sat in there and texted our loved ones and said, we don't know we had no windows. So we had literally zero idea what was happening, So I think there's pros and cons. I think there's a lot of panic that can happen because of cell phones that is unnecessary in those moments. And then there's also communication that's needed, right?
Well, Jessica, Aaron and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insights today. And I know our listeners will take a lot away from this. But before we wrap up, Aaron always has one more bigger picture question for you.
Okay, so if you could rewrite one societal rule about how we perceive childhood mental health, what would it be?
Absolutely. I think the biggest thing for me is to look below the behavior to understand why the behavior is coming up. I know that's a little bit more general and it's not necessarily like a rule that's out there in the world or a law, but I think at the end of the day, like our behavior says a lot about what we are personally going through in terms of our human experience. And if we take time to tune into that, to gain the awareness and to heal that part, a lot of times these behaviors, the maladaptive behaviors or, that kind of thing can be healed. And that just kind of changes who we are as people and as a society.
Thank you again for joining us and all of the incredible work that you are doing. It is very clear that, your story about what happened and your life change, you are on the right route. You are doing the right work. And it was truly a pleasure to have you on this show. So if the listeners and viewers want to connect with you to learn more about your work, how can they do so?
So if you go to Two Roads Therapy on Instagram, you can find me there. And I'm also on psychologytoday.com. You'll just search my name, Jessica Alexander, Kennesaw, Georgia, and then you can find more information about me and my therapy practice as well.
All right. So to everyone who is listening, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on post notifications so that you never miss an episode. If you're listening on your favorite podcast directory, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. Definitely make sure you share this episode with somebody who might find it helpful or just on your socials. Getting out the word is truly one of the best ways in which you can support our mission, help us getting these resources, skills, tools out to the next gen, out to marginalized communities, out to all of the different humans that we love and care about. So we appreciate you being here with us. Thank you so much and take care.